Yes, I will.
Thank you.
I mean,
It is. Oh, we got a note. We have been advised that it's being live streamed.
has not. Okay.
So hello to Jeff
2.
Lewis. I'm very excited that you're there watching us. That's why I wanted to know. I don't know that Jeff's been with us for almost 2 years at this point, so that's pretty special.
Yeah, and so just to kind of go over the format again, we talked about this, Jim, but it's a little bit loose, just how the flow is going. But generally, I like it by around 10:30, between 10:30 and 10:40, we would break to do the collection stuff like that, and then we go to the question and answer with the audience after that. So
that'll be perfect.
Okay. So Renee, are you going to pin the video?
I have no idea what, I mean, I know where that is, but I don't know what you mean by that.
When
I'm good.
When you have a speaker speaking and you don't want Joe's cough to suddenly switch the video to him,
Oh yeah.
you can pin Jim Nunnally and then it won't change. He will be. I'm sorry, spotlight, not pin, spotlight. Okay, spotlight.
Spotlight. Yes.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I will.
Okay.
I tried to put them both up there to start.
Yep.
So that's what I'm working on right now. And I know they keep.
You got 3 minutes.
Around, anyway.
And I'll mute when after do my questions. So
what am I supposed to do with this? Okay.
And Joe, one of the things we've never talked about is my age. You know, I'll be 80 my next birthday, which is in 3 months. And, you know, and I'm kind of a active relic, if you must. And every day I'm sort of asked that in many ways, but I consider that kind of an honor. And so I want you to get that in there as well. I don't mind it at all. Some people avoid their long years on this earth, but I kind of make mine very embraced, if you must.
And so you're turning 80 when?
In the summer of next year.
Okay.
But my, you know, I'm asked almost weekly to be on some kind of board. And some people ask me, what is my ultimate? And my ultimate is to be appointed to the AARP National Board. Now that's my ultimate. Now, why I say that is because I think it would be relevant, because I think I would have learned enough about being an agent to be effective in that particular role. So anyway, but I'm not there. Nobody's asked me yet. So I'm going to plug on until I get it.
Is there anyone up and coming to fill your very big shoes, Jim?
Yeah.
I think I've invested so much time in young people. Right now, I'm talking to 27 people at various points in their career about their career and about things that go on. And so that's my way of sort of making the deposit. And so, you know, that's kind of it.
Okay. Renee?
Yes.
I'm going to make you the official host so that I can disconnect. Okay. And then let somebody know if like it all crashes and you can't see anything. So,
okay, then. With those words of hope.
Yeah, well, you know, Zoom keeps changing things, but let's go ahead for it.
Okay.
Okay.
Awesome.
Renee is now the host.
All right, and it's 10 o'clock, so I think, Joe, we can
start.
So
I am going to leave. Why don't you not start for 30 seconds?
Okay.
All right, that'll give me a chance to run and turn the alarm off here.
Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, you don't want alarms going off. We got a little bit of everything today, don't we, Joe? Like we'll see animals running through here pretty soon or something. Herd of cattle.
Right, and you gotta get the office quiet here where I'm at.
Okay. All right. Well, it's recording already and it's streaming on YouTube already. So just start when starting feels right.
I guess it won't be before Jim returns.
Correct.
Okay, I'm back.
All right. Okay, so I guess we're ready to get going here. Okay, well, good morning and welcome everyone. Welcome to the All Souls Forum, coming to you via Zoom from All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church in Kansas City. I'm Joe Robertson, a member of this church and a committee member of the forum, which for decades has carried on important conversations promoting critical thinking on the most compelling and challenging issues of our day. Today, we welcome Jim Nunnally, a retired public health executive and a community activist who rallies people in a fight of social justice against diabetes, heart disease, COVID-19, and other killers that hit hardest on minorities and the poor. To give you an idea just of the range of Jim's service, I first came across Jim when I was covering Kansas City Public Schools for the Kansas City Star, and Jim was giving the youth of that school district the power and voice weekly on the radio and in the community. He's a product of the University of Michigan School of Public Health. He is the original chief operating officer of the Samuel U. Rogers Health Clinic in Kansas City. And he's the former program administrator for Combat, Jackson County's anti-drug and drug violence program. And he still goes on the radio weekly in the mission of public health with his show, Straight Talk About Diabetes. So Jim here, who's proud to be within a year of turning 80, is here with us today. And so Jim, to get started, there's an inequitable public health crisis fully exposed by the pandemic. How did we get here and what's our way out?
Thank you so much for inviting me. More importantly, thanks for edifying me beyond belief. I kind of struggled while you were talking there, and I said, I'm going to have a hard time living up to that. But how did we get here? Well, we got here by neglect, and we hope to get out of it by commitment. And let's talk about the neglect first. One of the things that people get with the statistics of this pandemic is how harsh it was. But the part that they left out was how it exposed all of the faults or overlooked items of the old healthcare system, or at least the system as it was. And so it kind of opened one eye and it shut another eye. And that's kind of how we got here. And we can talk more about that as we get along.
Well, there's so many people are suspicious of authority. We have a lot of defiance and a lot against top-down directives. I know you have been out there trying to work in the interest of public health in that environment, in that circumstance. I mean, how do you approach that? What works?
Well, the first thing that works is continual talking about it. There's only one thing that overcomes misinformation is more information. And then sooner or later that more information will sort of hopefully douse out the misinformation, and at least we'll be talking about the correct information. But I believe a media blitz, a conversation blitz, but most importantly, a professional to non-professional to patient conversation is essential.
You go ahead and tell us now, so where and why does public health fail? Well,
public health fails because it finds itself in an ocean of economic plights. And I say that because when you put healthcare or anything that's good in the middle of the economic market that we choose to go about, it gets lost. And the only thing that gets picked up are those things which are economically favorable. but the things that are sort of spiritually and generally unfavorable sort of gets left out, and therefore one day it comes up to bite you. And that's exactly what happened with the pandemic.
And you've also been talking about the role that the Black community plays for itself, and how that's affected the response to this. And just go ahead and fill us in about that. Tell us what you know and how that's been historically. I mean, let's talk about.
All right. Well, there. As I mentioned about the economic impact, sometimes if something isn't appealing economically, it gets overlooked. And I think some of the capacity in our community and other communities get overlooked because of a various number of reasons. And it's just like in this pandemic, when it came to vaccinations, you know, all of a sudden they had money and a problem, but they had no particular delivery system into our community now. So they used the traditional ones, which obviously work, but in a pandemic, you need more than that. So the overlooked part of our community is what I sometimes talk a lot about, because there's unused, unfelt, and needed capacity in our community that nobody speaks about. For example, there were 2 young ladies in this pandemic who got personally vaccinated, 500 people, just the 2 of them. And they didn't get it by all the technology that we say. They just went to their people that they knew, and it spread from there, and it made it. And I want to give a special shout out to Teresa Moore and to Linda Lamette. These people, unknown, no particular commitment to the public health area, but they knew people and they knew how to get to them. And so it's that kind of overlooked capacity that we must generate and continue to generate. Now, you know, when you ask me about the things that are going on, now let me just say this: being a part of the community health center movement, it's kind of interesting that how community health centers rose in this atmosphere, because we needed a delivery system. We didn't need a political system, and we didn't need a spiritual system, and we didn't necessarily need a professional system. What we needed was a delivery system. How do we get these vaccinations to the people? Because they're not only dying, but they threaten the rest of society as well. That's a different system than what's taught in our educational system. It's a different system that's taught in medical school. But most importantly, it's a different system that we don't ever talk about inside of our daily newspapers and whatever. But it's a system that works, and it would be horrible if this system was overlooked or forgotten.
So when we give, you know, the allies, the people that are wanting to work and make equitable healthcare, you know, and so talk to these things. What if we get this right, what does it look like?
Well, you often hear the term equity, and it's kind of like police defunding. It depending on who says it, they may mean a different thing. But well, I got to remind people that equity is a financial term. But what it looks like when it comes to healthcare is that we've got a part to play, and it's just as important as anybody else's part to play. It shouldn't be hand-me-downs or instructions down. It ought to be equally in reverse. And that's what I define equity as. And it's a difficult concept to get, but most importantly, it's a discussion term. You know, I like to see it in action. And I was speaking before a group of students at Harvard, and I must say that like that, not name dropping. But when I talk about equity, equity is a financial term. But as I begin to think about it, it may be the best way to get into equity itself. or health equity, because if you split the dollars right, if you split the budgetary emphasis right, then you'll get equity, or you'll get more equity than you had. So I'm no longer opposed to it being sounding like or even used as a financial term.
So the challenge that you have right now, compare that, tell me just about the, starting the youth, the health, the community health clinics, working with combat. What was the experiences in some of those efforts, and how does that compare to what you're trying to do today?
Well, it compares especially the young people. I'm one of the few older people who started young investing in the young people. Now, I say that because through this, I call it a community youth development operation. We took youth and started preparing them for college, not because they wanted to go to college, not because they ever stated that they wanted to go to college, not that they even had the money to go to college, but they needed to be ready. And part of that readiness is using terms and things that they're going to face so that the newness of college is not as new and as distracting as the education they should receive. Now, I know that's a mouthful, but I'll use my own personal experience. When I went to the University of Missouri in 1960, there were 17 Black folks in a cast of 17,000 Caucasian people. Now, that culture shock alone was enough to sort of cripple many of us, perhaps even for life. And so I decided early that I would put together a readiness or college readiness program, which would allow young people to experience what it's like to walk in and sort of let your education be first, as opposed to what your social life or what the order of the day was. And so with that in mind, that's what we did, was develop youth and develop in very practical ways. And one of the ways is just getting them to express themselves clearly. Now, I say that because so many times when a person of color speaks, they're speaking with so many thoughts in their mind. And one is their own thought. In addition to that is what society would expect me to say. And thirdly, the newest one is not sounding too radical where you won't be heard. So those have to be kind of sifted through and developed so that not only is it acceptable what you say, but it's veracious, it is true, and not be afraid to say it. So I spent 40 years, unpaid 40 years, by the way, and someone recognized me just recently, the NAACP, and I had logged 10,000 free hours to the development of youth. And I say that because that's what it's going to take. It's going to take more of that.
So what pains you the most, and where lies your hopes? I mean, like what are some of the personal setbacks you've seen?
Okay, what pains me the most? I guess the largest setback I've seen is the continual conversation about what should be taught to our children. And that's a pain because we never get past the conversation. And I remember the desegregation effort in the late 60s, and there were all kind of task forces set up that came up with different rules and different recommendations and whatever. But if you look back at that today, you will not only see a repeat of that same timing, but you won't see any movement. So that pains me. And the second thing that I build on are the youth. I mean, that really gets me. And as you know, I mean, it gets me happy. As you know, we worked with some youth during this pandemic. And of course, I was kind of chided for working with the youth because people said, the youth don't know anything about this. We need strong leadership. Well, I found out that the youth are more affected by the pandemic than people think. Now, the old people might have gotten it, but the young people were affected by it, and they lost their friends. They were quarantined from their parents that had the COVID, but most importantly, they felt powerless in a situation. And so I started working with the youth, and as you know, that snowball would gather, and we just kind of started giving them facts about the pandemic because they had never been in one before. But more importantly, they had to learn and build their airplane while it was in the sky. And they came through like champs. And I'm saying to you today, as a recommendation, whatever we do next, let's never exclude our young people. And young is anybody under 50 that hadn't had the experience. Sometimes the old people don't know what we need to know or what we need to do in this pandemic and other crises that we have. So include the young people, and that makes me happy.
How about some of the history that you've experienced in public health, going back to the University of Michigan days? I mean, and what are the misconceptions? What are the things that you are, and people that are in the same activity as you are trying to? What are the challenges to that, and our understanding of public health, and how's that got us where we are today?
Right. Well, the biggest challenge is the words have changed, but the necessity to implement something has not. I remember so well when I received a very large scholarship to the University of Michigan School of Public Health. They were talking about utilization, and the thing they said was, kept pounding in our heads, that people with a good education, people that are older, and people that are of color utilize the medical services differently. Now, I emphasize medical because that time it was said or thought that medical and public health were at least first cousins. The truth, they're not. They're two different things. One is part of the other. And of course, and this is hard to get over, is that the medical care is a part of public health. It's a part of public health that's delivered on the disease part of the world, or at least the world of health that is affected or diseased or needs some caring and whatever. But the other side is a protective, preventive atmosphere that's often overlooked. And that means that we're part of the world, but more importantly, there are other things to public health than just the healthcare itself. And for example, where you live, and we've had a lot of zip code analysis lately, what you think, the education, how you feel about things. And of course, with the pandemic, like what kind of diseases did you have before? Now, it's kind of interesting that when we talked about the pandemic, there was always a qualifier that people with compromising immune systems should be vaccinated first. And they were also the ones that were dying the quickest. Now, that is the definition, or at least the inclusive term of public health, because we're all affected, not just any particular person that happens to be sick. And of course, if you add to that race, and if you add to that, gender, and if you add to that education, and if you add to that age, then we're talking about an ever complicating thing, which is what really caused the pandemic. We weren't prepared too well on any of those fronts.
So how do we do better?
Well, we do better by, first of all, admitting that we didn't do better at first. And that's sometimes troublesome because it shows up in conversations that are had that continuously ask for more conversation. I'm beginning in my older age to think of conversation as not an act. It's sort of a ploy. And the longer we talk about it, the less we have time to do anything about it. So I would say act. And that act would be to include our young people and also to look at our whole vaccination system now that we're talking about a pandemic and what gets us out of it. Let's look at vaccinations for measles and smallpox. All these things we sort of take for granted, but somebody isn't getting them, because if you look at the public health records, you'll see that there's still evidence of unmet need that is still exists maybe 40 or 50 years from now. The second part of that is the inclusion of young leaders involved in that. And I keep going over that, Joe, because if we don't start listening to the people that are affected by whatever it is we're talking about, the top-down approach does not work. It's never worked. And we have been guilty as a race of people for sometimes not speaking up. And then when we speak up, we seem like we're speaking too harshly, but it's out of impatience and misunderstanding and inability to have spoken before. And so we must hear from the people that are affected by it. And I say that because it's tantamount to a choir singing a song. If you don't listen to the voices individually, you shouldn't expect the song to be a big hit.
So tell me in particular, the getting that message to, there's populations that have been very difficult. We seem to regressed it a lot through during this pandemic with the opportunity to learn things. It's hardened lines, and that includes in the African American community, I believe. You can talk about that, or and then the political divides. You've been crossing boundaries all along. How do we do this? What have you learned in this, and how do we go?
Well, I've learned that we're not too far along, because if we read the newspaper from 1960, we're almost at that same point. That's both tragic and enlightening. But the enlightening part is the younger people generally see quickly what needs to be fixed. We sort of have been sort of socialized into believing that understanding everything is the part of progress. We've never understood anything. As I look back in 1945, when we were engrossed in a war, we didn't understand war. We didn't understand, but we built the airplane in the sky. And some of these things with public health has to be done that. But I think the leadership should be shifted to the people who are most affected by it, rather than the top-down decision making. Now that I will stand on, and I know I'm going to get a lot of questions about that, but that's the way it should be. We've been too led by rather than included in. And I think that is the biggest message I want to send out today.
Well, expand on that then. I mean, how do you get that message out?
Well, again, back to the untapped resources. It's funny that we could move a program like Combat along real quickly, got it up and running, and it still lives today some 40 years later. And some things just kind of got talked about, never got off the ground. Now, the reason for that, or at least an important reason for that, is that we talked to the people who were affected by the drugs, and not only using drugs, our law enforcement. That kind of inclusivity allowed us to move in places where it could be felt, and we could establish building blocks and go forward. Now, how has that changed, or what would I say? I would say today is that we need more of that, at least about this pandemic. Now, it's interesting that we're going to have a new health director here soon. Rex Archer, a physician, has resigned from the Kansas City Health Department. And of course, the next question is, who's going to get that job? Now, who's going to get that job may on paper look wonderful, but really will negate or at least overlook what has been done up to that. So we start all over again. And the starting all over again is what hampers the world. We never go back. We always go back to chapter 1 and never think about the prologue or the foreword or the chapters before. We got to stop starting at the beginning. And how do you do that? You just got to know your community well enough. If there's any part of my success in this community, it's knowing this community, knowing the bartenders, knowing the traffic cops, knowing the school safety people, knowing the parking ticket attendants, knowing the school teachers, knowing everybody that you can know who has any kind of input into a complex system. And that takes time, but it's already in place in our community. It's just under-recognized and perhaps even undervalued. And that's what I would mean. So more of that. And I think you've come to know me long enough that I've been quiet for a long time, but I'm no longer quiet.
And why is that? Why?
Because I've been sort of a tactical person. I think that accounts for a lot of my success. Once something is decided, I work hard to get it implemented, but I also till the soil, and I get used to, before something happens, I get used to what it was like before, and also kind of put up comparative progress points that may not be just in the outcomes. It may be in the process. It may be in the structure. And let me give you an example of that in the community health movement. One of the most overlooked part of community health movements was that the people on the board of directors, the people had to have a majority. Now, they overlooked that because that was unheard of, and to this day, even unheard of. But it was very important to the community health movement. That meant that the people who received the services, largely poor, largely ethnic groups, were in the majority, were the policymakers. Now, you can't show me anything like that too often in this country where the people rule, or at least have the advantage of ruling if they choose to. Now that is where I came up. And I'm not saying that everybody should go out and make consumers the majority of a board. I'm not saying that, but I'm only saying that maybe you do have to be a little radical to get started, because the concept of that is that you always have involvement, or you always get the input if you want a better outcome. Now, how does that come? Remember Samuel U. Rogers, and is where I started, but it started in a public housing project. And when it started there, everybody sort of warned us about not being there or not being safe there. But, you know, the people lived there. So maybe it was us that felt like we weren't safe rather than the people, because the people live there every day. And so, but that notion of just being where the people are and seeing it from that point of view helped advance healthcare. And so, you know, when it came to immunization rates, and this is kind of interesting, but there was a school, and it was called Woodland School. And 95% of those kids were properly immunized. Not only a handful of kids did not get into school because of immunization or lack of immunizations, because the law requires that you have immunizations, and the immunizations require that you have parental signature. Well, you know, that was a difficult task. If you're not willing to take that task on, then you can't take on the bigger task of moving the healthcare needle. So it's those kinds of intimacies, I believe, that work, and they still continue to work, and may be the real overcoming obstacle that we need to address.
Well, can we scale that intimacy? I mean, what happened to Samuel Rogers and Woodland? Because we need that obviously badly today.
That's what I'm saying. And I'm really reiterating that nothing has changed, including the solutions. And you see, we don't dig down far enough into our community to find what's already been tried, what's already been done, so that, and we repeat it. So we stay in repeat and newness fashion a lot longer at the expense of getting the issue done. Now, let me get back to something that you know about, and that is Link's involvement in this. Now, I thought it was very interesting that Link, in doing this pandemic, came down in our community. They didn't say, come over here or go over here or whatever. Same did Truman, or University Health, as they call themselves now. I mean, they say, okay, let's go down there and let's make some partnerships. And no one will ever write this down, but we actively participated in avoiding our own death. Now that's the way you have to do it. You don't have to be a listener, and you really don't even have to give up any ground. What you do have to see is what's already being done, and kind of like what might be a good idea, and we don't need to be told what to do. Now that needs to be emphasized. And so if you're asking me practically what happens or what should happen, this take notes rather than charge. And that it's hard for us to do, or it seems to be hard for our community to do in total, but that's what you have to do if you really want to solve the problem. And I'm saying because there are systems in place. They may not be in the textbook, but they work every day. If you wonder why I'm surprised of, I'm so surprised that we aren't worse off than what we are. And, and if you read all the statistics, if we've got more of it, we got less. If you need less of it, we got more. And that goes on and on and on. And it has been going on for probably 70 or 80 years. But I always say, God, how do we do this? And it's because of people like those two ladies I talked about getting people vaccinated. There's no written rules. There's no job description. They just make it work. And sometimes that is undervalued, underappreciated, and therefore the inequity. And so how do we get there? We just listen a little bit more and take notes, as I said, and not just take in charge.
And then, of course, you got your plan to talk about diabetes behind you there. Certainly also tell us about the threat of diabetes and what you're doing on that.
Very good. Being around young people for so long, and then getting it to an age where I contracted diabetes, I kind of was familiar with what's being said professionally, but not what's being done about it already. And the biggest fault I found with the system is that the words got in the way. It's just like the technical term A1C. That's the new measure of whether or not you have or have not diabetes or not doing very well with it. And of course, we took that term A1C and found that the word A1C was not being understood to begin with. So if you change the wording to what we're used to, or at least teach the word, we'll do better with our A1C. Now, that's why it came to be plain talk. One of the real issues was about sugar diabetes. Everybody said diabetes. But obviously, for years, we called it in this community sugar diabetes or sugar. Now, that may not seem much, and it certainly isn't something that you'll find in a book, but it's really the truth as the way we operate when sugar comes around. So you've kind of got to de-word, or at least let the words, move the words out of the way so we can talk, and that's where plain talk is. And the other thing is that most people talk down to this community as if they don't know about diabetes. We know about diabetes. We just look around and we see all the amputations. We see the death certificates that say somebody dies from diabetes. We see all the kidney dialysis units that spring up. So we know about diabetes. You don't have to tell us about diabetes. What you really need to do is to listen to us. And as you look behind this placard behind me, all of these things came from people with diabetes asking them, what do we do about diabetes? They didn't come from textbooks. They didn't come from public service announcements. These came from the mouths of people. And surprisingly, exercise was the number one thing. Our cookbooks, or, like tell us what A1C is. Those are the things that came from the people with the diabetes. And they're really saying, if I'd have had this, I'd rather take this than diabetes itself. So the question is, it's that kind of basic, elementary, no great intelligence needed kind of activities that will move the needle. And that's exactly what happened during the pandemic. And doing this show on Plain Talk About Diabetes, we said, if you got diabetes, you go get a shot. It wasn't like why you need to get a shot. It wasn't anything about what political affiliation you were. It wasn't anything about professionals running this very erudite system of how many people were dying from it. It's like, if you got diabetes, you go get a shot. It was that simple. And that's what the roundup was about. And that's why we did well with our vaccinations in this community, particularly among the elderly. And yet there were people who felt that we were infringing on some people's rights, and I'm okay with that. But I'm only saying the plain talk came from just the plain talk and not letting the other things get in the way of the healthcare. Now, I want to applaud a lot of people. Link is one of those. I definitely want to applaud the Health Care Foundation, Health Forward Foundation, and many, many other well-meaning generals in this community that move the needle. University Health, all of these people came up at a time and showed that we really don't need a treatise. We don't need a seminar. We need action. And that action is what we need to proliferate in the coming months.
All right. Well, thank you much, Jim. We're listening to Jim Nunnally, retired public health executive, the first program administrator of the combat program, and many other things. And we're going to take a break here before we go to a question and answer from the audience. Now, and to give you an idea, just we do the questions and answers Zoom style. You will, down there under the reactions, you will find an option to click raise your hand, and then we will call on you as you're queued up in order. So I'll be getting some questions ready, and now we're going to take a break to do for a collection to support this weekly forum. Renee's going to put the link for that in the chat, how you can support the mission. And now, before we get back to Jim Nunnally, I also want to say that next week, tune in next Sunday, and we will have Heather Ann Thompson, the Pulitzer Prize winning author, will talk about her book, Blood in the Water, on the Attica prison uprising of the 1970s and what it means today. All right, so so now we will open it up for questions. I will start one as first of all, just while we're waiting, Jim, go ahead and talk about how did you get in this in the first place? Tell me what motivated just you to take the original course that you did.
Well, if you go way back, I actually came from Columbia, Missouri, and I was the admissions officer to a medical school. And of course, I wasn't claiming to be a physician, or did I have any desire to be a physician, but that was a job. And so I got to interact with the process of being admitted to medical school and the many applications that came forward. And just based on that, I began to kind of see how physicians were actually trained up close. And also kind of understanding that they were human people, they were bright, they could understand. But as I looked at the curriculum, it was decidedly toward the scientific end, and I have no problems with that. I just think it should have been bolstered by the reality of what happens to the people for whom they are going to learn a lot from them. And I began to glean a couple of other things, that when they always ask a lot of questions. And it seemed like their reliance on questions ended up in research papers, and not only in research papers, but, would also end up in practice. So I began to ask people, like, where did you get your information? And they got the information from the people that they were serving. And I thought that was interesting. And I never got over that. And by being in the dean's office, like I say, I learned a lot about the selection process, but I also learned a lot about the curriculum. And so I seem to be a perfect fit to be an initial part of this community health movement. By the way, Kansas City was second or third community health center in the nation. Today, there are over 2,000 community health centers nationwide. So that idea, worked, to go to the people, go where they are, but most importantly, listen to them. And so that listening ear is what I try to provide, to our people. And it sort of, I won't say it's the most important, but it's an essential part of it.
And starting up combat.
How
did that happen?
Well, I was drafted by this because just of my work in the community health. I don't know how I was drafted or why my name came up. It's just that one day they asked me would I like to take on a tough project. And of course, the part of appeal to me was that they wanted to actually make it a public health issue in addition to being a law enforcement issue. Now that attracted me because it meant mobilizing all the healthcare facilities to begin to treat drug addiction as a medical or a public health problem, not just as a criminal problem. Now I was grossly misunderstood when I took this job because everybody thought that, it is a criminal problem. Everybody that's a druggie should be locked up. And of course, my response to that, we cannot arrest our way out of this. We do have to have some idea of what it looks like from the ground up and not just from the act committed. And of course, using that approach, today, that program has lasted over 30 years, but it was that orientation that I took to the program. And I must say that I was drafted. I didn't ask for that job at all.
Okay, George's got a question.
All right, George.
Hey, George, are you unmuted?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, my friend Bob Berkabaugh and I were talking recently about his work in Greenburg, Kansas, and how he went to that community, and that when he asked them about participation and wanting their input, he found that these folks had not been ever asked much. And like in your topic about when you talk to people and ask them what their opinion there is or what they want to accomplish, do you find them somewhat surprised as well by being asked that question?
Yes, obviously. It's awkward to kind of flip the script. But if you really are interested in the solutions, you will find that it's like my mother once told me about the lion tamer. She said, you see, we put all the emphasis on the lion tamer and we never asked the lion, do they want to be tamed? And of course, out of that sort of grew a thought that maybe that is what is kind of wrong with our system, is that we're so top down. And yes, I am surprised.
Where else did you come across that? I mean, because what were the difficulties in the Samuel Rogers starting up that program?
Well, the difficulty that I faced was that we are part of the solution too. Now, in other words, just as much as I talk to you about what ought to be done, I have to also had to talk to our people about we have to do something too. We have to play our part, because part of the non-movement on issues are sometimes that we are too accustomed to being told what to do and not to do what we know what to do. And that takes some massaging, if you must, in my early days at Rogers Health Center, but it didn't take long. It didn't take long because results that count. Like I said, that 95% immunization rate did not come about because I had a good idea. It came about because they went all night. They went to the bars. They didn't call people just between 8 and 5. You know, they made it happen. And they lined up on the street corners and they lined up on the bus corners. And it was kind of interesting. One lady who who actually stood at the bus blocked the passageway to the boarding the bus if the kids weren't immunized. Now you might think that's kind of, you know, maybe getting in the way, but they knew whose kids were likely not to be immunized. It's that ground level effectiveness that is equal to winning any kind of war as it is to the strategies that go on in the boardrooms. The ground level is very important. It has to be appreciated, but more importantly, it has to be respected. And that is what the difference is. The ground level plus the boardroom direction makes a powerful combination, makes it easier to be victorious.
Now, how much harder is it now today? Because like when people who have authority or have actual information are out there waging this battle, like in case of, with the pandemic and COVID, against a lot of sources that don't have the information, like a certain NFL quarterback refers to reasons why he does things, and and there's these competing influences that don't have might not have this kind of sound basis that a public health authority comes with. How do you is it harder today, and how do you battle that?
Well, it's always hard because the issues change, or at least the approach to issues change. But what is more complicating is that more people can get a sip of information and take it beyond belief. And when I say sip, that's what they call misinformation today. They will see somebody that failed in the public school system and they conclude that all kids fail in the public school system. Not true. What it is that we only see what we're looking for, and we only talk about what we think we know. And that is always a problem, whether you got social media or not. So that means that you have to be in touch, and you have to be like the engineers. You have to go on a Gemba trip. You have to go where the issue is. But more importantly, listen to the solutions that are already in place and amplify and be willing to say that that might work rather than some notion that somebody from somewhere else thought they would work. And that's what we've done for years. We've tried to implement foreign solutions to community problems. And when I say foreign, I don't mean internationally foreign. I mean just people who are not part of the community making community decisions. It's really interesting. And one of the other things that you didn't mention, I was instrumental in putting together a political information system for elected officials. Now, the first misconception that we have is that elected officials represent their districts, and they do. But sometimes they get misinformation as well. So we put together a professional group that just sat down with the elected officials each week and informed them about healthcare issues and other issues. People love it. They still love it. It's still going on after 20 years or so, because it informs the elected officials that, there's something else going on here, or that something's already in place, or we don't have to reinvent the wheel, or maybe this is the budget implications. I was appalled when I first came on the scene at the community health center level, how few people actually read a budget. I mean, when I say read it, even know what's in it. They have no idea. And what I did was put together a budget reading committee. And that committee was 15 people, of which 4 of them were youngsters, and just combed through the budget and asked questions. And those questions led to bigger questions, but more importantly, sometimes the solutions were different after reading the budget than they were before. Now, I know it's arduous, and I know people will say I'm anal, but it's necessary if you really want to move the needle.
And let's just take this back to the pandemic situation and moving the needle there. Again, like I referred to, Aaron Rodgers. That's what's kind of the most current one. But I mean, how do you move the needle in this environment?
Well, you move the needle by not letting what is being said alter your course or alter your mission. Now, it's very easy to get off course, like with Aaron Rodgers, and believe that maybe there's some sort of extra terrestrial advantage that maybe Aaron Rodgers have that we don't know about. Okay, you can get off on that, but that doesn't stop the lady that's up the street who doesn't come out regularly from needing an immunization. So you got to be willing to go on and knock on that door and say, are you all right? Do you need an inoculation? And here's where you can go. And if you don't have it, here's where we can help you get there. It's got to be that simple. But it can't be 20 miles away. And I was really privileged with the inclusion of Walmart and all the other people into the vaccination campaign. I'm not sure how that came to be, but I can also say to you that they benefited greatly from the groundwork that had already been laid. The people who come to them didn't just start with them. They started with the many conversations that were had in convincing people that this was not a hoax, that this is really something that ought to happen. And I know my friend of mine from the Health Forward Foundation often talked about trusted leadership. Well, that's where trusted leadership comes into play. Like, really? And if you ever think about that, that doesn't sound like much. It certainly doesn't sound like something you would talk about in the classroom, but it's very important in our community that somebody who is trusted says that it's all right. And then you might get some more action from it. So we still need to bolster our leadership, bolster it to the point to where it's believed, where things that are suggested are acted upon, but most importantly, believed or at least trusted. And there is this natural tendency in our society for people to tell other people what to do or what they should do. It doesn't work. People know what they need to have to do, and they will do it. But it's really that simple, Joe. It's no magic in it. I mean, I find 80% of my life is listening. And when I say listening because there's a solution to the problem somewhere in there. And if we don't listen for those solutions, we for doggone sure are not going to implement something that we didn't even hear.
I guess I know you started this with your interest in really helping the youth, and I know you've done that with the COVID situation also. So talk about what you've seen in the teenagers. And
all right, now you're stringing at my heart. It was very interesting about our approach when it came to the teenagers. First of all, we were well ahead of the teenagers because the teenagers told me very frankly that teenagers don't want to take this shot. Now, I found that interesting because, that we put such an emphasis on immunizations, going to school and all of that would be the simpler part. But they said, please, whatever you do, spend some time with us till we get to understand what it is this COVID pandemic is all about. So I went out and gathered for free people who were knowledgeable about the COVID situation. I found someone from CDC. I found the people from University Health, from the community health centers, Swope and Rogers, who came down and just shared their information with the young people. Now, you saw this, Joe, and you know what I'm saying to you is that, first of all, the first lesson we learned is that they were not ignorant about COVID. Now, they were ignorant about the COVID as it affects most of the population because they haven't been here very long, but they were not ignorant about the effects of COVID. And what they kept saying was the misinformation is killing us. It's stopping us from even talking about it. And so what you must do first is not discount the people who are closest to the situation. And that goes for diabetes, that goes for lung association. And by the way, if you want to ask what am I going to do these next few months, I'm going to call up the American Lung Association, the American Diabetes Association, and all these things that say that they're in the leadership position about these diseases, and see if we can get some young people involved in it and get some solutions that are implementable over time. And that is what I'm going to do, because it's kind of funny that the American Lung Association has many people with asthma that died from COVID, that they're not doing what I'm already doing. I'm 80 years old. I shouldn't be doing this. I just keep wondering, where are they? Why aren't the American Diabetes Association at the forefront of this? Why aren't they dealing with the young people? And when I say dealing with the young people, I'm not talking about just bringing them in. I'm talking about the people who are down here who are dying from the COVID. Why aren't you talking to them? And so that's going to be one emphasis that I want to enjoin the resources and the advice and the techniques of all these agencies where these compromised morbidities were involved, and hopefully we'll get started on it. But young people are at the forefront of change, and we can't continue to neglect them. And they've got good ideas. Inside of 2 weeks' time, these young people had run with this idea. They'd gotten into touch with people in an instant that we old people would have taken us 2 years to get to. So there's some equal positioning at the table that we must include the young people behind. So I know that's a long-winded response to your question, but you get the idea.
All right, yeah, well, thanks, Jim. This is Jim Nunnally, a retired public health executive, social activist. Jim, any final thoughts? Anything that you want to send us away with?
Well, I kind of started earlier by talking about, since we've been talking about vaccinations, it might be a good time to look at vaccination. We certainly need to take a strong look at the position opening for health director in our community. But even more than that, we need to stay on this equity course and involve people who need to know or who can lead or who have been used to following. And we need to extricate that and maybe listen a little bit better to those people who are affected by whatever it is that we're trying to problem solve. And I know that seems difficult, but it ought to start pretty immediately. And it took me 80 years to get to this point. And I still feel like I'm a fifth grader when it comes to understanding the intricacies of how to get things done. And I just want our world to be safer, but most importantly, I want it to be healthier. And anybody wanting to take me on or advise me or whatever, I'm certainly willing to do that. But I got to this point in my life by considering the people first that are affected by whatever it is, whatever problem we're trying to solve. And that ought to be a part of the preamble of most organizations at this point in time. if you really want to solve the problem. And so I enjoy, if I sound like a radical, I am. If I sound like I'm peacemaking, I am. If it sounds like I'm a student, I am. If it sounds like I'm a leader, I am. But what I'm saying is there are hundreds, thousands more people just like me, more learned, more operationally minded, more get things done than I could ever conceive. And I can imagine what it's like to be across town, trusting somebody that you don't even know. But I've done it, and I've been very happy with the results.
All right. Well, thanks, Jim. I think we'll stop the recording now and
Thank you.
just kind of open it up.